Joining us now in studio is Sharon Bryce-Peace, our correspondent, normally based in the United States, but today he's joining us from the Republic of South Africa. Major case.
Good morning. The Republic of South Africa, look at you.
Good morning, welcome.
Good morning, good to be with you.
So you're joining us in South Africa, and we have this major case that has grabbed global attention. Tell us about what you make of this attention that has been given to this particular case, and also looking at how symbolic the matter is as well.
It's a case that has dominated, right? So out of the context of the ICJ, this has been a matter that has been before the international community, whether it's the General Assembly taking decisions on the Gaza war, whether it's been the efforts within and often failing efforts within the Security Council. So this is a matter that has been on the international agenda now for some time, of course, since the October 7th Hamas attack on Israel. And what this court's role is going to be is to provide clarity, right? People lower your expectations as to how it might change the calculus on the ground, whether it's going to have a immediate effect on in terms of the provisional measures that South Africa has requested, whether it's going to have an immediate effect on if the ICJ were to rule a certain way to ask Israel to stop these bombardments, then it's going to be a question of implementation. The ICJ is a court of law, it is an international tribunal, but it doesn't have a standing military that's going to go to Israel and enforce the decision. It's countries that do have recourse, they have recourse to take a decision from the ICJ to the Security Council, but then you know what the makeup is there, the veto power of certain countries that support Israel. So don't expect action necessarily, even if it were to fall in South Africa's favor in The Hague, that this is now suddenly going to change the calculus on the ground. What it's going to provide, though, is clarity on international law, clarity on what the Genocide Convention expects of parties that are signatory to it, right? Israel is a party to the Genocide Convention. They were one of the first parties in 1948 to sign. South Africa has subsequently signed in 1951. But they are on either sides of what the implementation of that treaty means. This is what the role of the court is going to pronounce on. Is Israel in violation of the commitments it itself has made in terms of that treaty? South Africa is saying it's not making those commitments. Israel, of course, will defend itself. The court will provide clarity on that matter.
And speaking there about the powers of the court as well, and after an order is handed down and the interim relief, especially that is being sought by South Africa, is if we look at the case that Ukraine has brought against Russia, after the court ordered that Russia should immediately stop its military operation in Ukraine, what happened?
They didn't, right? And so that conflict still continues. And so that was an advisory opinion, which is not legally binding, but it does also provide sort of moral clarity on whether who's the wrong party and who's the right party. But Russia didn't show up to that trial. Russia didn't send a defense team. They made an affidavit, I think, to the court subsequent to the arguments being made by Ukraine. Israel is sending a defense team, a top-tier defense team. They have put an ad hoc judge on the court. They are party to the Genocide Convention, which is what is essentially going to be ventilated here. So there's a different scenario here. This would be a legally binding decision. But as we've learned, legally binding don't mean legally binding.
Exactly, right. Legally binding to which extent? Right. So if the matter is going to go before the United Nations Security Council again to try and enforce this, and we know where, for instance, the United States stands.
Right, so legally binding, let's take one example, the 2016 resolution passed by the Security Council that said Israel's settlement expansion in occupied territories is without international force. They need to stop this. We will not recognize it. The international community has pronounced. Has Israel stopped its settlement expansion in the West Bank, in occupied territories that are supposed to be part of a future Palestinian state? No, they have not. Has there been any sanctions imposed by the international community? Has there been military action threatened by the Security Council? These are tools under Chapter 7 of the UN Charter available to the international community. But unfortunately, you have such divisions in the Council between the big powers, right? China, the United States, Russia, not so much with the UK and France, but so you have these powers that essentially, these five powers with veto power that essentially put their thumb on the scale. And whether you have 12 in consensus, 14 in consensus, one country can stymie a revolution in that sense, right? In terms of ordering Israel to stop this war. That's not going to happen. So binding is nice on paper, but its implementation is often wanting.
What does the ruling in favor of South Africa's application mean for the United States, and also considering the United States' relationship with Israel as well as the military aid?
It means that the United States will be backed further into a corner, right? So we know where the US stands. We know where Israel stands. And the US has struggled as this war has progressed and the atrocities in Gaza have mounted. They have now tried to really walk a very tightrope in terms of seeking greater humanitarian aid, but into Gaza, but also and stopping the wanton attacks on civilians, right? 60 to 70% of the casualties in Gaza are women and children. So they understand that. The protest movement in the United States has grown against the administration's posture in support of Ukraine. But it will further isolate the United States and Israel. We've seen that isolation in the General Assembly. 155 countries voted in favor of demanding an immediate ceasefire, the release of hostages, greater humanitarian access. Remember that Israel will say, well, we are letting humanitarian aid in, but the big ask from the international community is that it has to be at scale. And when the UN is talking about famine, that is not at scale. So it'll corner them a little bit more, it'll isolate them even further, and what it will allow countries in support of South Africa is to pick up that judgment from the ICJ and say, hey, you've been branded a genocide perpetrator, similar to the Nazis, right?
Yep.
The Holocaust. So Israel certainly wouldn't want that label, and that's why they're sending a top-tier team to defend its position. And let's talk about that position. What is their position? They will say that they were attacked first here. They will say that there was an atrocity committed on the Israeli civilians on October 7th, and no one denies that. People are in mourning. People are grieving the fact that 130 plus hostages are still being held in Hamas without the necessary access to the International Red Cross. So this is a grieving nation that is feeling a real pain based on what happened on October 7th. But does that exonerate them from their obligations under international law? This idea that there is collective punishment, which is illegal under international law, that is playing itself out in Gaza? No, it does not. So we need to walk and chew gum at the same time.
And of course, we've seen yesterday also, the day before yesterday actually, with David Cameron, the United Kingdom's Foreign Secretary, saying that actually what Israel is doing is that they should scale down, especially to try and make sure that they protect civilians. And the US has expressed something similar as well.
Let me tell you what the UN Charter says. It says, Article 93 of the Charter says this: all members, whether you're the United States, the UK, France, Russia, or China, and all the rest of the 193 members, all member states of the United Nations are ipso facto parties to the statute of the International Criminal Court. So let's forget about countries going, well, sovereignty, we don't respect this. Ipso facto means by virtue of the fact that you are a member state of the United Nations, you then must comply with this judicial organ of the institution you have subscribed to. It also says if any party to the case fails to perform the obligations incumbent upon it under the judgment rendered by the court, then the other party may seek recourse in the Security Council, and that's where it falls apart.
The confusion that sometimes comes, but what's the ICJ, what's the ICC?
It's an interesting question in the context that both these courts are grappling with the issue of Israel's military action in the Gaza Strip. The ICC is investigating. The prosecutor, Karim Khan, has launched an investigation. He has visited Gaza. He has crossed over through the Rafah border crossing with Egypt. So there is an investigation going into the criminal conduct of individuals involved in that matter. What the ICJ is going to do, the International Court of Justice today, is to explain whether Israel is in violation of its international law commitments made in terms of its signature nature to the Genocide Convention. So the ICJ deals with disputes between states, can be territorial disputes, the interpretation of a treaty, as is the case today. The ICC deals with the criminal conduct, aka also known as Omar al-Bashir, for example, right? What his role as an individual, what his military commander's role were in terms of the genocide that was perpetrated against tribes in Darfur. The criminal conduct in individuals go before the ICC, which is down the road from the ICJ, the International Criminal Court, which deals with justice, which deals with disputes between states.
Yeah. Does this mean that the ICJ wouldn't entertain a question, for instance, let's say, against an argument of crimes against humanity?
It's very much. So it's the interpretation of international law which deems a crime against humanity illegal under international law. So they will take the prescripts of the 1948 Convention against genocide and say, is Israel in violation of what this thing says, what this document tells us they can and cannot do? That's what the interpretation is going to be. It's not going to be about the criminal conduct of Benjamin Netanyahu, the criminal conduct of his IDF commanders. That is something that will fall to the ICC prosecutor, that must then go to the justices of the court, court. It's called a pre-trial chamber to determine the culpability or whether individuals must stand trial. The ICJ is dealing with what the conduct of an entire state is in this instance, the state of Israel.
And then the court having to interpret whether South Africa really does have a case when it comes to the violations, and also looking at proving a case of genocide and the intent thereof. Must South Africa be able to prove that there is a plan, and this is the plan, and this is how it has been executed? Yeah,
so let's understand what the Genocide Convention says. The 1948 Genocide Convention, allow me to read here, is an international treaty that binds the 153 states that are party to it, including Israel, Palestine, and South Africa. The convention explicitly gives the ICJ jurisdiction over disputes regarding the implementation. So it has jurisdiction, which means it's going to be binding on the parties that are signatory to the convention. The Genocide Convention defines genocide as acts committed with intent to destroy in whole or in part a national, ethnic, racial, or religious group as such. So the intent here is going to be very, very important. So South Africa is going to use the words of Israeli officials. It's going to point to what the United Nations is saying in terms of the wanton destruction of civilian infrastructure, which is a crime under international law. It is going to talk about collective punishment. It is going to talk about a state's obligations in terms of even when it's acting in self-defense, what are your obligations in terms of proportionality? Proportionality is a term they throw around a lot in terms of how countries are responding to a terrorist attack. Proportionality is important, collective punishment is important. These are all things that South Africa is going to prove. But you're right, intent is going to be key. Thank goodness I'm not one of the 17 judges sitting on that court.
Certainly. Well, of course, we have our former Deputy Chief Justice, Dikgang Moseneke, that will also be there and hearing this matter. But just back again on this issue around proving genocide, can Israel argue that on the basis of what happened on the 7th of October, they had the right to protect themselves and to protect their civilians, but also on top of that, their intention is to eliminate Hamas because they believe that Hamas wants to wipe Israel off the face of the earth? Can they argue and say that on that particular basis, we had every right to do so, even though the argument could be that perhaps what Hamas is doing is Hamas is using human shields, and therefore you can't then say that it is Israel that is guilty of a genocide when the perpetrator in their particular case is a person or a group in this particular case that are using civilians as human shields? Yeah, so this question of proportionality, right? So you talk about, is Israel going to point to what happened on October 7th? There's the broader context of the decades-long Palestinian conflict, which South Africa might also point to in terms of why, sort of the justification, to use that in inverted commas, why Hamas acted in the way that they did. But there's no question, I think the ICC prosecutor has already said that crimes against humanity were committed by Hamas against Israeli civilians. When you target civilians, when your intent is to target and kill civilians that are not part of the military apparatus, that amounts to a crime against humanity, whether it's genocide. That is a determination that... But it's proving the intent. Again, where Israel could argue that
it's proving who they
Hamas
targeted.
is using human shields.
It doesn't necessarily prove intent because you don't know what the intent was. Were they aiming to shoot that civilian, or was that collateral damage? So you'll hear this term collateral damage also used by the Israelis because they will argue that Hamas is using them as human shields. But if you look at the composition of the infrastructural makeup of Gaza, it is a densely populated enclave that is under siege. You cannot leave Gaza. You cannot move freely. So you have this 2.3 million people that are literally in an open-air prison that cannot move. They're told to move south because they're bombing in the north. They're told to move to the center of Gaza because they're now bombing in the south. Where are these people supposed to go if their infrastructure is being destroyed? So does genocidal intent mean you put people in a train and ship them off to a gas chamber, as what happened in Nazi Germany? Or can you still argue that there is a systematic nature to this? The dispossession of their properties, 60 to 70% of properties in Gaza have been destroyed. Where are these people supposed to go if they cannot cross the border? The decimation of the health infrastructure in Gaza. People cannot get the aid that they required. Israel is limiting the amount of aid. The UN is talking about starvation and famine. What is the end result of starvation? It might as well be putting someone on a train and taking them to a gas chamber. But obviously, these are issues that are going to have to be ventilated before a tribunal of competent judges and not the journalists standing in front of you today. Yeah, and actually, in those papers from the South African lawyers, they say that the starvation of civilians as a method of warfare. Let's quickly go to Musa, who's joining us from Durban. Musa, good morning.
Yes, good day to you, sir. How are you?
I'm well, thanks. You can go ahead.
Yes, look, First and foremost, I just want to say that in this instance, I stand with Israel. If, for instance, people would come into South Africa, attack civilians and take hostages from South Africa, I would love South Africa to bring them back at whatever cost. That's number one. Number two, when there was time for those release of hostages, Hamas was the one who stopped releasing hostages because we already had a week-long break in that war. Today, we could be talking about, could be pointing fingers directly at Israel if that issue has been sorted out. Thirdly, the issue of Hamas fighting from among civilians, I think that one, no one is talking about that. No one is condemning Hamas about that. You know, I just think that this narrative is so much one-sided. Yeah. Lastly, this thing about river to the sea. When Hamas and all those protesters who always we see on TV say from the river to the sea, where do they lead Israel? Are they also advocating for the wiping out of the Israeli nation? That is my take. And also, lastly,
Musa, South Africa has spoken out against Hamas's actions on the 7th of October.
Yes,
the president has. Let me finish. South Africa has spoken out against Hamas's actions on the 7th of October. And actually, in that application that is brought before the ICJ, in the first paragraph, they deal with that particular issue that happened on the 7th of October.
Yeah, well.
Okay, thank you. There is Musa there joining us from Durban. Let's quickly go to James. James, good morning. Your take. Hello, James. Can you hear us? Good morning, James. Sure, James, we can hear you. You can go ahead. Good morning. Okay, we're going to see if we can try and get back to James. James is struggling there. But I just quickly want to go back to the point that Musa is raising there, that if South Africa was to come under attack, I believe that everyone does expect of their nation to also go out and defend the nation and defend its civilians. However, though, there are rules.
I think Musa was on hold and wasn't listening to our conversation before that call because we literally just addressed the point he's making. There was an atrocity crime. I said that the ICC prosecutor has pointed to the atrocities that were committed against the Israeli civilians by Hamas on October 7th. The question then becomes, is Israel's response? We're not talking about whether they are justified or not. Yeah. Of course you're justified. The right to self-defense is part of the UN Charter. But is it proportional? Are they targeting the people that perpetrated the crime against Israel? Or has there been sort of a wanton, they talk about precision strikes, does it look like precision strikes to you? There's the question of human shields. Do you go through that human shield or do you go around it? These are questions that are going to be ventilated. But let's not undermine or underestimate the pain that Israelis are going through based on what happened on October 7th. There are hostages that are being held. Security Council, General Assembly resolutions have called for permanent ceasefire, for humanitarian aid, but also for access to the hostages while they are being held and for their immediate release. So that's part. You know, we have to walk and chew gum. I keep saying that. We can understand Israel's pain, but we can also understand the pain that's being inflicted on Palestinians today. And
let's look at some of the access that have come through at the agenda_SABC and at Aldrin Simpier. Okay, we don't seem to have those accesses yet, but we're going to try and put them up in the next short while. So that's at the agenda_SABC and also at Aldrin Simpier. Let's quickly deal with another issue in relation to this ongoing war. Essentially, is the possibility of it expanding. Hezbollah. We know that one of its military leaders has been killed. We also know that one of the leaders of Hamas have been killed in Lebanon as well. Then you also have the Houthis on the Red Sea. Yeah, and the Security Council pronouncing on those attacks, essentially calling on them and condemning the attacks and calling on the Houthis to stop those attacks. There were 4 abstentions, so it wasn't a unanimous decision. Russia, China, Algeria, and Mozambique abstaining, but there was no veto deployed because I think there's broad consensus that international maritime movements in the Red Sea, in international waters, needs to be protected because it has implications on everyone everywhere in the world.
Didn't the grains, the Black Sea grain deal teach us that lesson? But of course, Israel is targeting with precision strikes across its border with Lebanon. There have also, we understand, been strikes with Syria, so there is concern. There's a lot of sympathy with the Palestinian cause in the Middle East. I won't explain to you why that might be. A lot of Palestinian refugees live in places, have lived for decades outside of Palestine. They've lived in Lebanon, in Jordan, in places like Syria. So people understand the passions of it. People feel affected by what is happening in Gaza. They feel attached to the sentiment that Palestinians express. So there is a big concern that this might expand. But we did see the United States pull back its strike force. It had deployed 2 big frigates into the Mediterranean Sea at one point where we thought there could be an escalation. We understand that they've now pulled that back. So tempers appear to have been, seem to be tempering, but it remains a concern. Anthony Blinken, the Secretary of State, is in the region talking to different interlocutors in order to prevent this from going any further.
Just quickly on the Hezbollah matter, I saw that there was a report around an intelligence report from the US that says that if Israel was to go on a full-on attack on Hezbollah, it might lose the war.
Israel has a very powerful military. I think, I don't know the extent to which it will be able to fight a war on 2 fronts. It will be very expensive. They will depend more heavily on military support from countries like the United States. This becomes a very expensive exercise. When you look at what has happened in Ukraine, you're talking about hundreds of billions of dollars, trillions of rands that have been spent in terms of that war. So there's a huge economic cost. Development suffers. We don't talk about the sustainable development goals. Poverty will rise, food insecurity will rise, climate change is going to pronounce itself as a greater existential threat. So when you take your eye off the ball, all these other things pile up, and then you have too much to fight for. So Israel has the capacity, one believes, given its military strength, to fight on a number of fronts. But Hezbollah is no pushover. Hezbollah is no Hamas. Hezbollah has military means, and they have the backing of Iran. That could then blow this thing up into a regional conflict, and that's what countries like the United States and others are trying to prevent.
Let's quickly go back to James, joining us from Durban. James, good morning. You can go ahead.
Right. Good morning, Eldon. I think that South Africa has no jurisdiction to appear before the ICJ.
Oh, God. Okay.
Now, one of the reasons for this is South Africa's past behavior. Under President Zuma, ex-President Zuma, South Africa connived with one of the African leaders to leave the country when our own courts had stated that the person must stay in the country until it can be determined whether we must comply with the ICJ's request to arrest that president. South Africa refused to do so. In the second case, in Russia and Ukraine, South Africa connived with Putin not to come to this country. Otherwise, they'd have the conundrum of arresting him. Now, this type of behavior should not and cannot be tolerated by the ICJ.
Yeah. So, James, I think maybe we should make a distinction there. Maybe the argument from your end and the way that I'm hearing you is that South Africa doesn't have a moral standing, considering what you've now painted out, but not necessarily a legal standing to have jurisdiction at the court, the ICJ, because they do.
No. The ICJ has to get its act in order. The point in issue is that in our courts, domestic courts, our judges would not tolerate a position where the defendant ignores their orders, then comes in as the applicant and says, please, I need your help. But when an order was given against him, he refused to carry out the order. That's the point. Now, South Africa, I would like to see how South Africa is going to jump that hoop in the first place.
All right. That is James there from Durban. I think you might be conflating issues, but let's hear what your take is on that, Showan. And also, this is something that was actually brought up by the Israeli spokesperson when they were pushing against the South Africa's application in that first press briefing. They made reference to what happened with al-Bashir.
I mean, I think you said it. Maybe the moral question is one we can debate, but South Africa does have standing. It's a states party to the statute that created the International Court of Justice, as I read to you from the UN Charter. All member states are ipso facto under the jurisdiction of the court, so they can petition the court for clarity. What South Africa is essentially asking here is for clarity as to whether Israel is committing genocide. We can talk about whether South Africa has the moral authority based on its actions. Remember, that was ventilated in South African courts. It went up to the Supreme Court of Appeal in Bloemfontein, which said South Africa was in the wrong. Did South Africa then violate its obligations in terms of the Rome Statute? What James was referring to in terms of Russian President Vladimir Putin coming to the BRICS summit last August? No, they did not. They might have had private conversations and said, hey, my friend, please don't come. But they certainly didn't violate the Rome Statute. They upheld their obligations by saying, hey, if you come, we have to arrest you. Please don't, because that's not going to be a good look for you. There was another argument I heard in terms of the Omar al-Bashir case that a Rome Statute party had never before the al-Bashir case, attending that AU summit in Johannesburg, where a states party had to arrest a head of state and hand them over to a court. That nearly hadn't. A state has handed over maybe a former president. The Bagbo case in Ivory Coast, it was his successor, Ouattara, I think, that handed him over to the court. So it wasn't a third party that had to arrest a foreign head of state. That was an unprecedented moment for South Africa, which they felt they needed to then ventilate in the courts. Right or wrong, that's what happened. South Africa didn't do it a second time because the courts had pronounced themselves.
Let's go to Tladi. Tladi, good morning. Your take. Or was it Khadi? Sorry, apologies.
Yes.
Khadi, good morning.
Yes, morning, my boy. How are you?
Good, Khadi.
Good. I want to respond on your topic.
Okay.
Yeah. On this one, I want to talk about my government. It's not fair. Okay? My government is not fair because they know there's always tension between Israel and Palestine. And then on the 7th, when the Israelis attacked, we, people of South Africa or the Palestinians, because we always know that the Palestinians and Israelis are not in good terms. We didn't stand up on the second day. So that to show that we want to have peace, the Palestinians want to have peace with Israel, and Israel want to have peace with Palestine. So what they are doing today, my government, which I love so much, they are right to take people to court. Yes, we have to have laws. But what they are doing to us as South Africans, and taking sides in such a way, because today I wanted to see Hamas also taking Hamas to court to what they have done to Israelis. They should also take Hamas to court what they have done to Israelis. And then I want to tell you, my boy, these people saying about apartheid when they come into our country, they don't know apartheid. We are the one blacks of South Africa, we've seen apartheid, what it does to a person. When they talk about the apartheid, our apartheid, not their apartheid of Israel, they don't know it because there's apartheid of ours that they're talking about. It gave them a preference. They are the one, the apartheid is the one that led these people when they have chaos to come in our country, because our country welcomes everybody who is being maybe attacked in any way or another, so that they must be in a safe environment. But when people find out they are sitting comfortably, and then when things happen, they tend to take sides. We can't take sides right now. Palestine and Israel, they're both in wrong.
Khadi, why not? When you were during the height of apartheid, it was the international community that also took a side. Why do you think that South Africa shouldn't take a side?
But now, we are grown now, because if we are misled, but now I can see they can't take sides, but they cannot take sides.
Yeah, but why not?
They must also tell Hamas to come to court. They must say it straight away. Even the Palestinians, they must tell Hamas to stop what they're doing. They're not saying that. They're quiet. They don't tell Hamas to stop. They're quiet. I know they are fighting the fight that we've been fighting in this country, but they're not even condemning Hamas, what they're doing to people, to kill people.
Well, Khadi, like we pointed out,
saying anything about Hamas.
Sure.
They're not saying anything.
That's not true, Khadi. It's not true.
It's not true.
It's not true.
But
Go
we
and
see
read
it
the
on
document.
television. They don't.
It's not true, Khadi. It's not true. Go and read the application before the ICJ and see what South Africa has to say there about the conduct of Hamas. And again, the president has spoken out against the actions of Hamas. It's not true that South Africa...
We must know.
Khadi,
People on the ground, we must also know that this Hamas must also take him to court. We must know that they're taking Hamas to court. They must take Hamas to court. They must be there.
Okay, so Khadi arguing there that the South African government should also be taking Hamas to court. Hamas, of course, is not a state, but tell me about that particular argument.
Hamas's actions are being investigated by the International Criminal Court.
ICC.
Karim Khan, the ICC prosecutor, is looking at both sides. He's looking at the ongoing Israeli Defense Force action in Gaza. And remember, Khadi, it is ongoing. It is happening. The death toll is spiraling. The health system is collapsing. There was an attack on October 7th. Let's not, and we do not want to diminish that. That was an atrocity crime that is going to be ventilated by the ICC. South Africa is seeking clarity from the ICJ, the International Court of Justice, as to whether the response of Israel is amounting to a contravention of a treaty Israel signed in 1948, known as the Genocide Convention. So it's a very specific thing. You can't just take Hamas to court. That is at the purview of the ICC prosecutor, who is already investigating their actions. And one might imagine that something might come to fruition from those investigations.
But there is also, I guess, some merit to the argument around how South Africa's stance against Hamas, for instance, that it isn't as vocal and forthright when it comes to Hamas as compared to Israel. But we're also speaking here about a historical relationship, and also speaking here about, for instance, earlier on, you're speaking about Nelson Mandela and his stance around what's happening.
Who I might remind you was a commander in Mkhonto Sizwe, right? Was arrested for what the apartheid government at the time deemed actions against the state. And so there is that synergy between the African National Congress government and understanding and appreciation in the broader context of what Hamas is doing. But that I don't want to, certainly coming out of my mouth, want to justify the actions that were perpetrated by Hamas against civilians. Those are issues that are being investigated by competent bodies known as the ICC.